You know, life has a strange way of teaching you lessons you never asked for. Sometimes it breaks you first, shatters everything you thought you had, before it shows you what really matters. That night, the night I lost everything, I sat in a run-down diner on the edge of Highway 22, somewhere outside of Dallas. The rain was coming down hard, the kind that sounds like 1,000 tiny nails hitting the roof. My hands were still shaking from what had just happened. My company gone, my wife gone, my home gone. And then this old man, must have been older than me, maybe in his 70s, walked in, soaked to the bone. He looked right at me like he knew me. Without saying a word, he slid into the booth across from me, stared for a second, and said 5 words that would change the rest of my life. You still have your soul. I didn't know it then. But those words would lead me down a road I never expected to take. A road filled with betrayal, revenge, and a truth that nearly destroyed me twice. My name's Robert Hayes, and if you'd told me 10 years ago that I'd end up a 65-year-old man sitting alone in a diner, with nothing left to my name, I would have laughed in your face. Back then I had it all, a house overlooking Lake Travis, a business that made 7 figures, a wife who smiled like she meant it, and 2 kids who thought I hung the moon. I was the kind of man who believed money could solve anything. If something broke, I'd buy a new one. If someone hurt me, I'd buy their silence. I thought success made me untouchable. Turns out it just made me a bigger target. It started slow. Little things. My business partner, Greg, began acting different. Missing meetings, whispering on calls, avoiding eye contact. I brushed it off. Then the accounts started coming up short. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. I didn't panic at first. Greg was like a brother to me. We'd built that company from scratch. I trusted him with everything. Then came the night that changed it all. I got a call from my lawyer, Mark. His voice was low, uneasy. "Robert," he said, "you might want to sit down." He told me Greg had transferred nearly all our assets out of the company and into offshore accounts under his name. Every dollar we'd made over 20 years, gone. Just like that. I remember driving to Greg's place that night. The sky was dark and the air smelled like rain. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they turned white. I wasn't angry, at least not yet. I was numb. When I pulled up, his lights were on. I could see him through the window, laughing, holding a glass of whiskey. My wife was there too. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no. There she was, my wife of 30 years, sitting on his couch, wearing the same necklace I'd bought her for our anniversary. I stood there in the rain for what felt like forever, watching them. When I finally walked up to the door, I didn't knock. I just opened it. The sound of the rain mixed with the laughter stopped everything. "They both froze. Robert!" She started, her face pale. Greg set his drink down slowly. "Listen, man, I didn't let him finish. I threw the first punch before I even thought about it. Years of trust, friendship, and love, all burned away in a single swing." He hit the table, glass shattering everywhere. She screamed my name, but I didn't stop. I wanted him to feel what I was feeling. Every ounce of betrayal tearing through my chest. But I didn't kill him. Could have, but I didn't. I left him bleeding and I walked out. The rain hit my face like punishment. By the time I got home, the police were already waiting. Greg had pressed charges, of course. His wife now backed him up. They froze my accounts, seized my home, and by morning, my reputation was dust. That's how I ended up in that diner, wet, cold, and hollow. That's when the old man sat across from me and said those 5 words, "You still have your soul." At first I thought he was just another stranger trying to make small talk with a broken man. But his eyes, they were different. They weren't pitying me. They were measuring me. He leaned forward and said quietly, "The real test isn't what they took. It's what you do next." And just like that, he left. No name, no number, no explanation. But those words, "what you do next," echoed in my head for weeks. And eventually, they led me to the one thing I had left to give. Payback. For a long time after that night, I let the world do whatever it wanted to me. I drank at odd hours. I slept in until the light came in strange through the blinds. The phone rang and I let it ring. People left messages, sympathetic voices, thin offers of help, a few guilty ones. I deleted most of them. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone who'd watched me fall and then pretended not to. but sitting in a diner with rain still in your clothes does funny things to a mind. Sharpens certain edges. You either let the fractures swallow you, or you start picking up the pieces. I picked up a napkin, folded it, and wrote 2 words on it. Figure it out. That was all. It felt like a small, stubborn decision, like stepping off a curb into cold air. The first practical thing I did was breathe. I called an old friend, Ellen Park, who'd once been my company's CFO before she left for greener pastures. Ellen was smart in a way most people aren't. She could look at a spreadsheet and see where the lies were hiding like splinters. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Rob, you okay?" she asked. "No," I said. Honesty felt cleaner than excuses. But I'm not done. There was a pause, and then, "Come to my office tomorrow. Bring whatever you have." When I arrived, her office smelled like coffee and new leather. The skyline stuck out beyond her window, glass and steel that used to look like trophies to me. Now it felt like the gaudy set of a play I'd walked out of. Ellen didn't small talk. She poured coffee and set a stack of legal pads between us. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her. I told her about the call from Mark and the transfers. I told her about finding my wife in Greg's living room, about the fight, about the police, about the accounts frozen and the humiliation that followed. I didn't leave out the punch. I told her the way the whiskey had tasted like lead when I pulled away from the table. She listened the way surgeons listen, quiet, taking notes without flinching. When I finished, she rubbed her forehead and said, "There are 2 paths here, Rob. 1, you let the system work. Lawyers, audits, maybe criminal charges. 2, you get back what you can, quietly, before they can hide it. Both are messy. Both are slow. Which do you think?" I asked. She let the question hang. "You asked me to help. I can do both. I won't promise fairy tales, but I can promise that if there's a paper trail, I'll find it. If there are shell companies, I'll find them. If there are offshore accounts, we'll dig. But you have to be ready to play hard, and you have to be ready to lose things along the way." When she said play hard, I felt a pulse of the old hunger come back. I wanted to hurt them, not for the sake of cruelty, but because they'd made my life into a joke. Revenge, I learned, isn't about getting even. It's about restoring some measure of order to a world that's been thrown into chaos. Ellen introduced me to a private investigator named Mike Alvarez. Mike had the kind of face that made you trust him, and the kind of moral flexibility that meant he could look at a problem from every angle. He used to do insurance work, fraud cases mostly, so he had an eye for one crooked ledger among 100 clean ones. Why me? I asked Mike the first time we sat across from each other at a cafe. The steam from the coffee fogged the rim of his glasses. "You look like a man who doesn't know how to quit," he said. "Or maybe you're just stubborn." "Both," I said. "Which is bad, right?" "Only for your enemies," he smiled. We started small. Mike dug into Greg's recent purchases, his travel history, and any corporate filings he could find. Ellen swam through bank statements and emails, looking for the seams where the fabric had been stitched poorly. I watched and learned like a man learning to use tools again. There were surprises. Greg had a lot of friends who liked to keep their hands clean, but money makes people complicated. One night Mike called and said, "You're not going to like this, Rob. Greg's been funneling money to a property trust under a woman's name. Her name is Annabelle Cole. She's listed as a benefactor, but the trust's registration was handled by a law firm connected to your ex-wife's family." I felt the world tilt. It wasn't just Greg. It wasn't just a sudden betrayal of a friend. It was an architecture of deception that had been built carefully, with people and places set up to look like coincidence. "What about offshore?" I asked. "Likely," Mike said. "But offshore requires time, and time leaves traces. We'll need patience. We'll need to be quiet. A loud man gets noticed. You don't want to be noticed." That idea, quiet, became the backbone of my plan. I would not storm a house and shout about betrayals. I would not go on talk shows or scream at cameras. I would be methodical. I would use the same language they used, files, filings, transactions, and turn it against them. The old man's 5 words kept coming back to me. "You still have your soul." It sounded like an accusation at first, as if he were saying I'd been soulless in my pursuit of money. But over time I realized it was a warning and an anchor. He wasn't saying I should stay a saint. He was saying I shouldn't sell myself to become some kind of monster. You could fight without becoming the thing you hated. That moral tether mattered more than I expected. There were nights when I imagined cold revenge, exposing my wife on live television, burning their reputations in a public bonfire. Those fantasies were easy and sweet and cheap. But when I remembered the man at the diner and the way his eyes had measured me, I put the fantasies back in the drawer. I would make them pay, yes, but without losing my center. Ellen had a useful way of framing things. You'll need patience, evidence, and allies, she said. You'll need to get people who have nothing to gain but the truth. Those are the most dangerous because their motives are clean. We found one such ally in a woman named Harriet Moon, a mid-level accountant at Greg's firm who'd been shoved out after she questioned a suspicious wire. She'd tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. She was perfect, bitter enough to help, cautious enough not to create false evidence. She agreed to come forward and pull old spreadsheets. She cried when she handed Ellen a dusty flash drive. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she said. I just wanted to sleep. There were practical lessons too. I learned how to anonymize emails, how to request corporate records without tipping off people, how to set up discreet meetings so that a grown man didn't have to wait in the rain for a stranger at a diner. Technology can be a weapon in the hands of people who know how to use it. It can also be a shield. We used both weeks past. We stitched together a map of the deceit. Shell companies, convenient intermediaries, property transfers titled in cousins' names, a trail that went from local banks to small offshore accounts. Each link we uncovered felt like a small win. The legal coldness of a spreadsheet had a certain poetry when it revealed the names of liar and thief. But the quiet part took its toll. People in my town started watching me again. The looks were different now, not pitying but curious, like they could tell something was brewing. I caught my son's eye at a baseball game and saw the confusion there. He didn't understand why his father looked older and harder at the same time. One night, Ellen leaned back in her chair and said, "If we go public with this, people will die financially. Legal pressure will unravel things fast. You sure you want that?" I thought of the cold eyes of the man in the diner, the way he had held judgment and possibility in the same glance. I thought of my own hands, the ones that had thrown a punch and the ones that were now learning to hold a pen and a phone and a ledger. Revenge was not clean. It never is. But there was a kind of repair in making the crooked straight. Yes, I said. Do it. So we began the slow, quiet work of preparing the case, collecting, verifying, and securing the evidence so that when the day came there would be no question about the truth. My life, which had been hollowed out overnight, finally had a rhythm again. It was still raw and it still hurt, but it had direction. The night I lost everything had become the hinge on which the next part of my life turned. By the third month, I had learned that revenge isn't a single act. It's a slow burn. It's waking up every day with the same quiet fire in your chest and pretending to be ordinary while you rebuild your war plan in silence. Rented a small apartment above a hardware store in Waco. The place smelled like paint and dust, but it was mine. I didn't need the lake view or the polished marble floors anymore. I needed privacy, a desk and an internet connection that didn't ask questions. The first morning there, I sat with my black coffee, opened my laptop, and stared at a list of names Ellen had compiled. Greg's new business partners, shell companies, and the legal firms that had handled every dirty move. Each one was a piece of the puzzle that had taken everything from me. Ellen said it best. If you want to take down a man like Greg, you don't kick down his door. You pull out the foundations he's standing on until he collapses on his own. That became my mission. Mike, the investigator, started trailing Greg. Nothing illegal, just observations. Where he went, who he met, what kind of deals he was making now that my company was gone. One night around 11 p.m., Mike called me. His voice was low. "Rob, you might want to hear this. Greg's in Houston tonight. He's meeting someone at the Rosemont Hotel. Name's Bradley Kent. He's a fund manager. Looks like your boy is trying to wash money through a new investment scheme." I leaned back in my chair, my heart steady but heavy. "How sure are you?" "I'm watching him right now." He just handed the guy a folder, thick one, smiling like a man who's never been caught. I smiled too, but mine wasn't the kind you show your friends. "Get pictures, Mike. Every angle you can. A few days later, Ellen and I went over the photos together. Greg shaking hands. Greg holding a document folder. Greg standing next to Bradley outside the hotel bar. She exhaled. This man's not even subtle. He's trying to rebuild your old company under a new name, North Track Holdings. Same logo, same clients. He's betting you're too broken to fight back. I stared at the pictures. Then let's prove him wrong. We spent the next week digging into North Track. Ellen found that the company had been registered under a proxy name, Annabelle Cole, the same woman Mike had mentioned earlier. She wasn't just a random signature. She was Greg's new partner in every sense. I didn't flinch. I had burned through anger months ago. Now there was only focus. I called Ellen the next morning. We need leverage. Not gossip, not rumors. Something legal, something that'll stick. She nodded. There's one way. Get someone on the inside. Someone who's close enough to Greg to touch the money. That sounded almost impossible. Until Mike called again. You're not gonna believe this, he said. Greg hired a new personal assistant. 24 years old. Goes by the name Laura. Guess who she's related to? I frowned. Who? Harriet Moon, the accountant who gave us that flash drive. It was like fate had decided to toss me a line. Harriet confirmed it later. Laura was her niece. When I met Laura, she looked nervous but determined. We met in a coffee shop near the university. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. My aunt told me what happened. Greg thinks I'm just another temp. I see everything, emails, calls, client lists. I can help you, Mr. Hayes. I looked her straight in the eyes. Laura, if you do this, there's no going back. He'll ruin you if he finds out, she nodded. He already ruined my aunt. I'm not afraid. That was the first night I saw the plan start to take shape for real. Through Laura, we began getting documents directly from Greg's desk. Contracts, internal memos, invoices, all leading to the same offshore accounts. Ellen cross-checked them one by one. It was a spider web, exactly as I suspected. North Track Holdings was just a shiny front for laundering stolen assets. My assets. He was funneling the money through fake clients, moving it into real estate in Florida and New York, then flipping the properties for clean profit, and every paper trail we found made the walls close in tighter. One night, while Ellen was sorting files, she looked up at me. Rob, I need to ask something. What happens when you win? When Greg's destroyed, when your wife loses everything? What's left for you? I paused. The question stung because it was fair. I hadn't thought beyond the finish line. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe peace. Maybe nothing. But he can't walk away clean. Not after what he did. She nodded slowly. Just don't let the fire burn you too. By now, Laura had been sending us data for nearly a month. One night, she sent a message that made my heart stop. He's planning a private investor dinner in Austin next Friday. He'll present fake financials to secure a $20 million deal. I can get the documents. Ellen's eyes lit up. That's it, Rob. That's the nail in the coffin. Catch him committing fraud in real time. And it's over. The plan was simple. Laura would copy the presentation files. Ellen would verify their authenticity. And Mike would be on site during the event to capture proof. For the first time in months, I felt something like victory within reach. I stood by the window that night, looking out over the quiet street below. The hardware store sign flickered, humming softly in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The old man's words echoed again. You still have your soul, I whispered back into the night. I hope so, because soon I was going to take everything back. The investor dinner was held in one of those glass towers downtown, slick marble floors, a chandelier that looked like a waterfall frozen mid-splash. Greg loved places like that. They made him feel like the world had been cut to his measurements. I almost laughed when Mike handed me the fake donor badge that let me in. I'd never been comfortable in rooms like that, but I could wear a suit and a face. That was all I needed. Ellen and Mike had mapped everything. Laura had sent the investor packet an hour before the event. Slides, spreadsheets, projected returns that glittered like fool's gold. She'd copied everything off Greg's laptop while he went to the bathroom. It took guts for a 24-year-old to jank a flash drive from her boss's computer and send it to a middle-aged man trying to be invisible in a marble lobby. But she did it, and for the first time in months I felt less like a wreck and more like a man with a plan. We split roles without fanfare. Mike would be at the door, recording faces and names. Ellen would be in the back, ready to verify the documents and call in an anonymous tip if needed. Laura texted me one line before the doors opened. "I'm in the ladies' room." "He's on his way, pray." I walked in and let the room swallow me. Men in tuxes, women in silk, the clink of champagne flutes, the kind of wealth that never smelled like work. Greg was the center of it, doing the easy thing he'd always done, smiling, shaking hands, naming names. He introduced me to a few potential investors as a friend of the family, and I nodded like an actor who'd learned his lines. When he took the podium, the room quieted. He spoke with smooth cadence, called up slides that showed growth curves and fancy logo placements. He talked about vision, about strategic consolidation, about trust. He quoted numbers with the kind of confidence that makes people stop thinking and start signing things. That's when Laura slid me a text. "Play this one first. It'll rattle him." I watched Greg for a beat, then stood up. It felt ridiculous. A 65-year-old man suddenly deciding to interrupt an investor pitch. But Mike had trained me on how to be unremarkable. I simply raised my glass and called out, "Greg, could I have a word?" Heads turned. A few polite coughs. Greg smiled that shark smile and waved me up. He didn't expect anything real. No one ever did. Up close, he was paler than I remembered. "Rob," he said, too casual. "Surprised to see you. Enjoy the evening." I let the applause that followed fade and said, loud enough for the front rows to catch, "I am, actually. But I'd rather the people putting their money here heard the whole story, don't you?" A murmur. Greg's smile hardened. "This isn't the time for—" "Tell them about the Florida condos," I said. "Tell them about the shell companies. Tell them about the payments to Coal Trust." The room got very still. People shift uneasily when polished men smell smoke. He laughed too loud. "Who filled your head with this?" I reached into my inside pocket and handed him a copy of a single slide, one Laura had pulled from his presentation folder, annotated by Ellen to show the fake revenue streams. She'd highlighted the same transactions we'd been tracking like hunters. I didn't gloat. I simply stood there and let the room read. There are few things more satisfying than seeing someone's mask crack. Greg's jaw tightened so much I thought it might pop. He looked at the slide, then at me, then at the crowd. "This is theft," he spat. "This is libel." "Then explain it," I said. "Tell these people why returns are guaranteed when the money backing them comes from transfers tied to my name." I let the words hang. The investor beside me shifted and squinted. People who make money for a living hate surprises. That was the moment Mike chose. He'd been streaming the event to Ellen via a disguised app, and had already sent a secure link to a reporter he trusted, someone who'd been waiting with patience and an appetite for truth. The link pinged in a few phones around the room. A woman at a corner table, an angel investor, tapped her phone and frowned. She looked up at Greg with a new expression, suspicion. Greg's expletive was soft. He tried to recover, smooth smiles, a joke, but his eyes betrayed him. He reached for the laptop to move to the next slide. That's when Laura, from the ladies' room, started answering the questions people were whispering. She texted a small packet to the same reporter and to Ellen. Internal memos, invoices, an audio clip of Greg discussing how to clean payments. The room, once a bowl of polished faces, had become a small theater of accusation. The investor near me asked a question, simple, precise. Are those returns based on current revenue or projected gains from recent acquisitions? Greg tried to answer, but Ellen's voice came into the room. Not loud, not theatrical, simply in a calm tone she'd had for years in conference rooms. Those returns are based on projected gains that are unsupported by audited financials. Several acquisitions are currently under review for misreported valuations. A hush like falling fabric. Glasses were set down. Men's faces that once looked so confident went slack. Greg's panic was subtle, the twitch in his hand, the way his smile began to tremble. He turned to the crowd, looking for a friendly face to anchor him, and found none. I felt something like sorrow then. Not for Greg, he'd chosen his path, but for the people in that room who'd trusted a man because his suit was tight and his handshake firm. They'd been sold a story. Now they were unwrapping the lie. Security moved before any real violence could happen. Firm hands, polite but unyielding. Greg stood and tried to shout over the murmur, but the momentum had left him. Investors came up to the front, asking for copies of the documents, calling their own counsel. Phones lit up. The reporter who'd received the packet whispered to his editor over the phone. Within an hour, the event had turned into an emergency meeting. Greg stormed out, cut across the lobby, and disappeared into a black SUV. I watched him go and felt the cold satisfaction of justice not as a roar, but as a careful, inevitable unraveling. But satisfaction wasn't the same as peace. When I scanned the room, I saw her, my wife. She was at the far table. Isn't that the maddening thing? People sit where they always sit, expecting the same old script. She looked smaller, her face pale, hands folded like someone praying. Our eyes locked, and for a moment the past came back. Dinners, cheap fights, laughter. Her mouth moved. I could see her say his name. She didn't stand. She looked like a person watching a play where she'd been both actor and audience, the realization finally catching up. She caught my eye and then looked away as if the stare had a heat that burned. I don't know if she saw me as an enemy or a prophet. She looked like someone who'd lost more than money. By the time I walked out into the humid night, the glass tower behind me was buzzing with calls. The story would hit the wire by morning. By afternoon, audits would open. It wasn't the end, far from it, but it was a fracture. Empires often begin to collapse at the edges, not with explosions. A missed payment here, a reneged contract there, a whispered doubt in a high-net-worth lounge, and the whole thing tilts. Laura texted me once I got into my car. I did it. I'm sorry. I'm scared. I thought of the old man from the diner and his 5 words. You still have your soul. That night, as I drove under the neon smudge of a late-night taco joint sign, I felt a steadying in my chest. Revenge, carefully done, could be honest work. It could expose truth without destroying the worker who held the torch. I wasn't the same man who'd walked into Greg's house and thrown a fist. That version of me had been loud and messy and driven by pain. The man who left the glass tower that night was quieter, older, and in a way more dangerous, because he'd learned to wait, to use patience like a scalpel. We had their attention now. That was the first victory. They fought like cornered animals. When the story hit the wire less than 24 hours after the investor event, it spread faster than I could have imagined. Financial blogs picked it up. A weekend show clipped a minute of the footage, and within 3 days there were subpoenas and frozen accounts. For a man who built his identity on being untouchable, Greg reacted predictably, with fury and with lawyers. But fury, I learned, makes you sloppy. Lawyers make you slow. The first retaliation was petty and personal. A smear campaign appeared online. Anonymized posts painting me as a disgruntled ex-CEO out to reclaim what I'd lost. My phone buzzed with calls from old clients asking if the rumors were true. My son texted once, then twice, asking if I was doing okay. There was fear in his words that hurt more than anything Greg had ever done. I ignored most of it. The truth was thin and stubborn. It shows up eventually. Lies need amplification to survive. Then the legal guns came out. Greg filed a cease and desist, accusing us of slander, hacking, and unlawful surveillance. His lawyers painted Laura as a thief who'd broken her contract. They painted Ellen as a disgraced CFO searching for relevance. They painted me as a vengeful has-been. The press lapped it up. For a week, the narrative teetered between 2 versions. The fallen hero coming for his prize, and the businessman exposed by whistleblowers. I didn't panic. Ellen kept working quietly, insulating our sources, encrypting files, and lining up witness statements. Mike tracked every lawyer's move like a hawk. Harriet and Laura went into hiding. Laura with her aunt. Harriet out of town with a cousin who let her sleep on a sagging couch. I made sure both of them were safe. Nothing we were doing would be worth a life lost in the fray. But the personal attacks cut deeper than anything legal. My wife, Grace, sent me a text that was short and precise. Don't contact me again. No explanation, no plea. Just a line that felt like a verdict. It stung in a way that the courthouse never could. She'd been the axis of my life once. To have her draw that circle and close it without looking back felt like a stake in the chest. That night, I drove to the old pier and sat for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel. The river looked like ink, and the city lights reflected like broken promises. If I'm honest, I wanted to call her, to beg, to explain. But every time I pictured her face, I also pictured the necklace on Greg's mantle. Some things aren't about reconciliation. They're about accountability. Public pressure had a way of working through other systems that were more efficient than blogs and angry calls. The banks that had dealings with Greg's new shell companies began their own quiet reviews. A lender called to freeze a line of credit. A contractor pulled out of a pending deal after consulting with counsel. It wasn't dramatic. No headlines, no dramatic confrontations, but it was effective. A business that depends on trust can't survive very long with that trust in question. Then came the most dangerous retaliation. One evening, as I was locking up a small storage unit where we kept backup documents, I found the lock tampered with. Thank God for Mike watching cameras. He'd moved the security footage to a safe drive and flagged a blurry figure lingering around the storage facility late at night. Whoever it was had been careful, but they'd underestimated two things: Mike's patience and the fact that people who do dirty work often get sloppy when they're tired. We tightened security. I started sleeping with the lights on and kept a baseball bat beside the bed like some pathetic talisman. It felt ridiculous at first, an old man and a wooden bat, but fear sharpens resolve. When you've had everything taken from you once, the idea of losing more becomes a current that runs under everything you do. The legal battle took another turn when a whistleblower from Greg's inner circle, someone I'd thought would never turn, contacted Ellen. Turns out money makes enemies of convenience. Greg had trusted a man named Darren Cole, who'd been feeding him favorable inspections in exchange for lucrative contracts. Darren, now staring at an inquiry from federal investigators, offered a different kind of deal: testimony in exchange for leniency. He said he'd been coerced, threatened, and paid to look the other way. He said something else that made my stomach drop. He had audio of Greg discussing the cleanup after the night I'd shown up at his house. I'd forgotten about that night. In the rawness of betrayal, I'd assumed the past was sealed, a private wound. But Darren's tape painted it differently. Greg talking about ensuring loyalty through fear, about making people disappear or comply. The man I'd once called a friend had a darker side I hadn't fully seen. That tape became a lever that dug at the foundation of his denials. With Darren's cooperation, subpoenas widened. The grand jury started to ask questions only a jury asks, questions that turned routine accounts into criminal inquiries. Greg's law firm counseled him to take a plea. Instead, he chose to fight. Pride is a costly currency. Meanwhile, out of the limelight, I had conversations I hadn't expected. My son Matthew showed up at my door one afternoon, his face pasty and tired from lack of sleep. "Dad," he said, voice hoarse, "I talked to my mom. She says she's sorry about everything, but..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The fissure between them was real, a canyon of hurt that doesn't allow easy bridges. We sat on the porch in a silence that was heavy but not empty. He asked me if I regretted going after Greg. That question, simple and brutal, started something I hadn't let myself think about. Reprisal leaves scars beyond accounts and properties. It takes privacy, relationships, the small normal things that anchor someone to their everyday life. "No," I told him after a while. "I don't regret it. Not entirely. What I regret is not seeing things sooner. Maybe then none of this would have happened." My son nodded, eyes glassy. "People make mistakes, Dad," he said finally. "But you did this for more than yourself." Those words meant more than any legal victory would. The battle we'd started wasn't just to recover money or reputation. It was to remind people that some things, honesty, fairness, still mattered. It was to show my son and anyone watching that you don't let predators think they can act without consequence. The months of litigation ground on. There were nights I felt like a man being chewed slowly by a machine too big to fully comprehend. But there were also small, bright moments. Laura calling to say she'd started a small accounting course. Harriet getting a job offer from a firm that promised integrity. Ellen taking a weekend off to swim for the first time in years. Those were the wins that mattered most. While the system ground through its legal motions, life continued to give and take in its ordinary ways. In the end, the thing that finally cracked Greg wasn't a courtroom bombshell or a public shaming. It was a loss of confidence. Investors pulled back. Contracts dried up. Men who'd stood by him found it safer to walk away than to risk their names on a sinking ship. Pride and money are poor substitutes for trust. When he finally called me, it wasn't to apologize. It was to negotiate. His voice was low, worn. "Rob," he said, "I need to talk terms." He wanted to buy his way out. He wanted to reframe, to pay, to bargain. He'd underestimated one fact. I didn't want his money. I wanted truth and a measure of repair for those he'd hurt. We set the terms, slowly, painfully. He agreed to return certain assets, to disclose accounts, to cooperate with investigators. The federal inquiry would take its course. Restitution would follow where possible. Not everything would come back. Many properties had been flipped beyond recall. But when he signed the agreements, I felt a small, precise relief. It wasn't victory in the old sense. It wasn't the gleeful revenge I'd imagined in the first months. It was accountability. And when I finally saw Greg in court, the man who had smiled his way through boardrooms now moved with the tentative step of a man who'd learned a lesson the hard way. He avoided my eyes when possible. Once when our gazes locked, there was no apology. Only a flicker of recognition of what he'd cost both of us that winter. As the court papers stacked and the settlement drafts circulated, I learned something I hadn't expected. Revenge, when it's done with purpose and not purely for anger, can become a hard kind of healing. It doesn't fix everything, doesn't mend every broken thing, but it can return balance to a world that had been skewed by greed. I kept the old man's words in my head. You still have your soul. Maybe that's why I chose over and over the harder path. I could have burned everything down and left a ruin. Instead, I picked apart the lies piece by piece until they couldn't stand. The night I lost everything had turned into a year of hearings, phone calls, and small victories. It taught me who I really was when the scaffolding of my life was stripped away. And when the dust settled, I found that certain things mattered more than I'd admitted. My son's respect, the quiet of honest work, the knowledge that I had stood up when it mattered. The day the trial started, the courthouse felt like a different country. Hallways smelled of wax and old coffee. Men in suits moved with the quiet confidence of people who believed systems were on their side. I did not belong among them, but I sat in the front row like a man waiting to be measured. Sitting there, I kept thinking about that old man in the diner who'd said 5 words. You still have your soul. I had used those words like a compass. I had let them point me toward a version of justice that did not make me small. Now I had to prove it in a room full of strangers. Greg walked in like a man who still thought the world would bend back to him. He had shaved, his hair slicked to hide the late nights, but his hands trembled under the table. When the judge called the courtroom to order, the air tightened. The prosecutor was sharp and exact. She moved through the evidence with a surgeon's hand. Wire transfers, invoices, emails with suggestive language, depositions from people who'd been coerced into silence. Ellen sat with me during the court breaks, a stack of documents my lifeline. Mike stood in the back ready to answer the small questions that only someone who watched the world move in the dark could answer. When they called my name to testify, my knees felt the weight of the years. Standing at the witness box, hearing the clerk say my full name, I felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because the man I once was, confident, certain, had been raised. Larger because I'd chosen to stand and name what had been stolen. The defense tried to paint me as a bitter man. They asked about the night I showed up at Greg's house, about the punch, about my drinking. They pulled up old tax forms, marriage counseling notes, the small embarrassments of a life lived in the open. They wanted to make me look like a liar in case my words fell apart. I told the truth. It was simpler and meaner than any crafted lie. I told them what I saw in his living room. I told them what I found in bank statements. I told them how it felt to lose everything in a single night. I did not cry. I did not rage. I spoke plainly because plain truth is a kind of weapon when there is nothing left to hide behind. Outside the courtroom, reporters lingered like gulls. People wanted the drama of a ruined man taking vengeance. I told them the same thing I kept telling myself. Justice is not performance. It is consequence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. We called witnesses who had once been silent because fear had been easier than truth. We played recordings of conversations where Greg discussed ways to manage people who might talk. We called accountants who had been paid to look the other way. Each testimony was another brick in a wall that left him with nowhere to hide. The hardest moment came unexpectedly. Greg's wife, no more than a woman who'd worn a life I helped build, sat in the gallery with her hands folded. She had been the linchpin in my life and the fulcrum of my anger. For months I'd dreamed of scenes where she would stand and confess, where she'd beg, where our old life would be clarified with a few neat words. That did not happen. Instead, during a break, she walked up to where I was sitting and said quietly, "I am sorry for what you lost." She didn't ask for forgiveness or offer an explanation. It was a small human thing in the middle of a spectacle. I answered her the only way I could. "I don't want an apology that costs me nothing. I want you to tell the truth when people ask. Let the law do what only the law can do." Her eyes filled for a second and then hardened. The process had cost her something too. Not the things we could calculate with ledgers, but the slow erosion of faith that had been part of being human in a small town. When the jury returned, their faces were unreadable. They had been tasked with weighing paper into people. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts. The words should have felt like a bell. I felt tired instead. The machine had run its course. Men who'd once laughed in boardrooms were now being led to face consequences. Greg was sentenced to 8 years. It was not a sentence that returned my house or the trust of clients. It was a sentence that said, in a legal voice, that there had been a rupture and someone must answer. After the sentencing, I did something I had not allowed myself to do for a long time. I walked out to the small bench behind the courthouse where the late afternoon sun was warm and sat down. The old man's words settled around me. "You still have your soul." That soul had seen a lot of filth. It had been tempted to become the same. A week later, I found a letter slipped under my door with no return address. Inside was a small note. The handwriting was steady and old. It read, "You did the hard thing. Keep living," no signature. The note was useless and perfect. The truth is, revenge had been a doorway, not a destination. The months of fighting changed more than Greg's bank accounts. It changed me. I sold the last of the assets that had been tied up in the fight and used the money not to buy myself a lake house, but to make reparation where I could. I helped settle claims from small investors who'd lost life savings. I paid for legal fees for employees who'd been blackmailed into silence. It was not enough to erase the pain, but it was something a ledger could show and a judge could not. My son and I spoke more. He watched the trial on nights he could not sleep and asked questions I answered honestly. He said once, "Dad, are you okay?" And I heard in his voice the things I had once wanted to hide. "No," I told him, "but I am working on it." That felt like a truthful answer. There were nights when the emptiness returned. You don't get used to being robbed of your life. You learn to build a new one, the way a gardener replants a plot after a storm. The new garden is different. It might have fewer roses, but it grows. Several months later, I went back to the diner where the old man had sat. It was a Wednesday, and the place smelled of fryer oil and coffee. I slid into the booth where he'd been, thinking he might be a phantom, something my grief had conjured up. He was there, exactly the same, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the door like he expected someone. He looked at me and smiled without surprise. "You kept your promise to yourself," he said. "Didn't you?" I stared. "What promise?" "Not to become the thing you hated," he answered. He had that soft, certain way of talking that made you feel like the truth was just a matter of patience. I told him about the trial, and about the restitution, and about the nights I still woke up and smelled smoke. He listened, nodding in the small, considerate ways that make someone feel seen. At the end, he reached into his coat and slid a small coin across the formica. It was worn and silvered. "For the road," he said. "You don't owe it to me. You owed it to yourself." I picked it up. On one side was a highway marker, an old design I hadn't seen in years. I put the coin in my pocket and left the diner feeling like a man who had moved through something that had taken much, and given back some, and learned to breathe again. The fight had been brutal. It had left scars. But it also taught me that vengeance could be guided by something clearer. It taught me that the soul the old man spoke of wasn't a moral credit to be cashed in. It was the choice to keep your humanity even when the world is trying to turn you into a weapon. There was one last thing I had yet to do. I had to answer a question in my own life, one that had no legal remedy. I had to decide whether the woman who had done the worst thing to me still had a place in the life I was rebuilding. I did not have the answer yet. For now, I walked slowly, with the coin in my pocket and the knowledge that justice, when tempered with mercy, can leave a man with room to breathe. It's strange how quiet life becomes when the noise of revenge fades away. The courthouse doors closed months ago, but I still wake up before sunrise, half expecting another phone call, another headline, another emergency that pulls me back into the chaos. The silence feels heavy at first, like the world is waiting for me to declare what kind of man I've become. I moved out of the city. Too many memories there, too many ghosts. I bought a small cabin near Lake Superior, the kind of place where the air smells clean and pine needles crunch under your boots. There's no Wi-Fi most days, and the neighbors mind their own business. That's all I ever wanted, peace, not approval. The mornings are my favorite. I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog crawl across the lake. Sometimes when the wind hits right, I can almost hear the sound of the city again. Horns, footsteps, the hum of ambition. Then I blink and all I hear are birds. I don't know if that's progress or punishment. Maybe both. The trial made Greg a public cautionary tale. His empire dissolved like sugar in water. Investors pulled out. His properties went into foreclosure. And his name vanished from the front pages as fast as it appeared. I thought seeing him fall would feel like victory, but it didn't. It just felt over, like a storm that finally runs out of rain. A few weeks ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Inside were 5 simple words written in black ink. You still have your soul. It was from the old man. Or maybe someone pretending to be him. I'll never know. The diner where I met him burned down last winter. And when I went to find him, the owner said no one fitting that description had ever worked there. No records, no name. Just a story that began with a stranger and ended with 5 words that changed everything. That letter made me think about all the pieces I'd been avoiding, the people I'd hurt in my pursuit of justice. My wife Grace, my son Matthew. Even the younger version of me who once believed that loyalty could be measured in contracts and smiles. I owed them something. I drove back to my old neighborhood for the first time in years. The streets looked smaller. The house I'd lost now belonged to a family with kids, bikes on the lawn, laughter spilling out of the open garage. I sat in my car across the street for nearly an hour before Grace stepped outside, holding a grocery bag. She saw me. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. When she finally walked up to the car, there was a long, heavy pause between us, the kind of silence that used to live in our marriage before it broke. Then she said, "You look older." I laughed softly. "So do you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. I told her everything, the revenge, the trial, the old man, the letter. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You did what you thought was right." But right doesn't always fix what's broken. She was right. Some damage doesn't heal. It just changes shape. Before she left, she handed me a small photo, our son at his college graduation. "He forgives you," she said. "But you need to tell him that you forgive yourself." That night, I sat in my car and cried for the first time in years. Not because of guilt or regret, but because forgiveness, real forgiveness, feels heavier than revenge ever did. Now, months later, I've learned to live differently. I volunteer at a local community center, helping young men who've lost their way, some to greed, others to anger. When they ask why I do it, I tell them the truth. Because one night I lost everything, and a stranger gave me back my soul. Sometimes I wonder who that old man really was. Maybe he was just a passerby. Maybe he was a version of myself, older, wiser, sent to remind me that losing everything doesn't mean losing who you are. Either way, his words became my map out of the dark. On quiet nights, I take out that silver coin he gave me. I keep it on the table beside my bed. It catches the moonlight just right, like it's alive, reflecting everything I've been through. I turn it over in my hand and whisper, "I still have it, my soul, my story." And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes the real revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's rebuilding yourself so completely that they no longer have any power over who you become. And as the sun rises over the lake, Painting gold across the water, I realize I didn't just survive the night I lost everything. I found everything that really mattered. The diner was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts too clearly. The hum of the fridge, the soft clinking of a spoon in a coffee cup, it all felt heavy. Richard sat in his usual corner booth, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee gone cold. It had been a year since that night. The fire, the confrontation, the loss. The weight of everything he'd done still lived in his chest like a stone he couldn't set down. Revenge had given him purpose, but it hadn't given him peace. He looked older now, his beard gray and uneven, his eyes sunken with sleepless nights. Most days he'd just drive aimlessly through the empty streets of Blue Ridge, ending up here, in this quiet diner where nobody asked too many questions. Tonight, though, felt different. The rain outside wasn't as harsh. The air smelled cleaner, and across from him sat a stranger, an old man, maybe 70, dressed in a worn flannel shirt and faded jeans. He looked like he'd seen too many winters and buried too many regrets. They didn't talk for a long time. The old man stirred his coffee, eyes distant. Finally, he looked at Richard and said quietly, "You look like a man who's been to hell and back." Richard gave a tired half-smile. "Something like that," the old man nodded slowly. "You ever wonder what you brought back from there?" The question hit harder than Richard expected. He swallowed, staring at the coffee. "Not sure I came back at all." For a while, neither of them spoke. The diner clock ticked. The rain softened. Then the old man leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You know, son," he said, "revenge doesn't end when you win, it ends when you forgive yourself." Richard froze. Those 5 words, "forgive yourself and move on," landed like a punch to the chest. The old man stood up, dropped a few bills on the counter and walked out into the rain. Richard sat there, replaying the words again and again. Forgive yourself and move on. He thought about the faces he'd lost. His wife, his son, and the ones he'd hurt trying to even the score. He realized then that revenge hadn't brought them back. It had only kept him chained to the past. The next morning he drove back to the ruins of his old home for the first time since the fire. The land was overgrown, but the scent of ashes still lingered. He stood there in silence, letting the memories wash over him. For the first time in years, he didn't fight the tears. He whispered to the wind, "I'm sorry," and something shifted. The weight began to lift. Months later, Richard moved out of town. He started volunteering at a local shelter, fixing things, teaching kids how to build furniture. People knew him as the quiet old man who smiled a lot but talked little. They never knew his story, and he never offered it. One evening, a young man asked him, "Why do you help people so much?" Richard paused, thinking back to that rainy night in the diner. He smiled faintly and said, "Because someone once told me 5 words I'll never forget." The boy tilted his head. "What words?" Richard looked out the window, the sunset reflecting in his eyes. Forgive yourself and move on. And for the first time in decades, he truly had.